a mop, a bucket, and a minimum wage badge. That was all the world saw when they looked at Daniel. So when a ruthless billionaire CEO sneered at him, hurling a vicious insult in fluent Arabic to amuse her wealthy investors, she expected him to look down in shame. Instead, the exhausted single father leaned on his mop, locked eyes with her, and replied with an ancient grace that made the entire boardroom freeze. She had just crossed the one man who held the key to her empire's greatest secret. The alarm clock buzzed with a dull, grating hum at 4 a.m., slicing through the freezing chill of the Chicago morning. Daniel Miller reached out a calloused hand, silencing the machine before it could wake the small, fragile figure sleeping in the twin bed across the cramped studio apartment. He sat up, the springs of his old mattress protesting softly, and rubbed the sleep from his deeply lined face. At 38, Daniel looked a decade older. His hair, once a vibrant chestnut, was heavily threaded with silver, and his shoulders carried a permanent stoop, bent by the invisible, crushing weight of the world. He walked quietly to the edge of the twin bed and looked down at his 7-year-old daughter, Chloe. Her chest rose and fell in a steady, albeit slightly wheezy, rhythm. The heavy winter blankets were pulled tight up to her chin. Beside her bed sat a medical nebulizer and a stack of expensive steroid inhalers. Chloe's severe chronic respiratory condition was the center of Daniel's universe, and the primary reason he was currently strapping on steel-toed boots and a faded blue uniform bearing the logo of a commercial cleaning company. Daniel had not always been invisible. Just 5 years ago, he was Dr. Daniel Miller, a celebrated, tenured professor of Near Eastern languages and civilizations at Georgetown University. He had published groundbreaking papers on the evolution of Semitic languages, specializing in Classical Arabic, Aramaic, and Nabatean dialects. He was a man who spent his days deciphering ancient texts, respected by peers across the globe. But life, Daniel had learned, was notoriously indifferent to academic accolades. When his wife, Rachel, was diagnosed with an aggressive, rare neurological disease, the world they had built together shattered. The treatments at Johns Hopkins Hospital were experimental, largely out-of-network, and astronomically expensive. Daniel liquidated his retirement accounts, sold their home, and took out massive personal loans from high-interest lenders to keep his wife alive. Despite his desperate, frantic efforts, Rachel passed away, leaving Daniel with a broken heart, a mountain of insurmountable medical debt, and a grieving toddler whose own health was rapidly deteriorating. His academic career fell apart in the aftermath. Forced into bankruptcy and heavily garnished by aggressive creditors, Daniel realized that a professor's salary, heavily taxed and garnished, could not cover Chloe's daily medical needs and the premium private health insurance required to keep her alive. He needed a job with a rock-solid, blue-collar union health plan, one that covered specialized pediatric pulmonary care without question. Thus, Dr. Daniel Miller, the brilliant linguist, swallowed his pride, packed his remaining books into a duffel bag, and moved to Chicago to become a nighttime and early morning janitor for the towering corporate skyscrapers of the financial district. Today, his assignment was the 54th floor of the Harrington Building, a monolithic structure of glass and black steel overlooking Lake Michigan. It was the global headquarters of Harrington Logistics and Real Estate, a multi-billion-dollar empire run by its ruthless 32-year-old CEO, Evelyn Harrington. Evelyn was everything Daniel was not. Aggressively visible, wildly wealthy, and entirely detached from the struggles of ordinary people. Born into unimaginable wealth, she had taken over her father's company at 28 and immediately began cutting away what she called the dead weight. She was notorious in the financial world. A shark wrapped in tailored designer suits with a sharp, angular face, piercing blue eyes, and a heart that seemed perfectly synchronized with the cold ticking of the Patek Philippe watch on her wrist. At 6 a.m., while Daniel was quietly pushing his yellow mop bucket through the marble-floored lobby, Evelyn was already in her penthouse office, preparing for the most critical meeting of her career. Harrington Logistics was attempting to secure a massive $4 billion capital injection from a global energy and infrastructure fund. The lead negotiator and head of the fund was Richard Montgomery. Richard was a formidable man in his late 50s, a former high-level diplomat who had spent nearly 3 decades stationed in the Middle East. Richard was famous for his deep, almost obsessive appreciation for Arab culture, history, and language. He used his fluency in Arabic as a psychological weapon in boardrooms, often switching languages to test the intelligence and cultural agility of his potential partners. Evelyn knew this. She had spent the last 2 years obsessively studying modern standard Arabic with elite private tutors, strictly to prepare for negotiations with men like Richard. For Evelyn, language was not a bridge to connect with humanity. It was a bludgeon. It was a tool to establish dominance, to prove she was the smartest, most capable person in the room. As Daniel finished wiping down the glass turnstiles in the lobby, his mind drifted to the ancient poetry of Al-Mutanabi, reciting the rhythmic, sweeping verses in his head to pass the time. He had no idea that 60 floors above him, a collision of worlds was rapidly approaching. The executive boardroom on the 54th floor was a masterpiece of intimidating architecture. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a dizzying view of the Chicago skyline, while a massive single-slab mahogany table dominated the center of the room. At 9 a.m., the atmosphere inside was thick with tension. Evelyn Harrington sat at the head of the table, her posture rigid, her expression carefully composed into a mask of polite aggression. Flanking her were her top executives, including her chief financial officer, a nervous, perpetually sweating man named William. Across the table sat Richard Montgomery and his team of sharp-suited analysts. The negotiations had been grueling. Richard was probing every weakness in Harrington Logistics' international supply chain, demanding concessions that Evelyn was loath to give. "Your warehousing infrastructure in Dubai is aging, Evelyn," Richard said, leaning back in his leather chair, his voice smooth but carrying an undeniable edge. "You're asking us to inject $4 billion into a network that is fundamentally reliant on outsourced, low-tier labor. How do you expect to maintain quality control when your ground-level workers are severely underpaid and under-resourced?" Evelyn offered a thin, razor-sharp smile. "Efficiency, Richard. Our profit margins remain the highest in the sector precisely because we do not overvalue the bottom rung of the ladder. Labor is a commodity. When a part breaks, you replaced it. You don't weep for the machine." Richard raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed by her coldness, though he recognized the brutal business logic. A ruthless philosophy. But loyalty from the bottom often prevents the top from toppling. Before Evelyn could snap back a retort, a sudden commotion broke the tension. William, the nervous CFO, reached for his water glass, but his hand caught the handle of a large, heavy carafe of dark roast coffee. It tipped over with a heavy clatter, sending a wave of steaming black liquid spilling across the mahogany table and splashing down onto the pristine, custom-woven white rug beneath it. "Damn it, William," Evelyn hissed, her composure slipping for a fraction of a second. "I'm so sorry, Evelyn, William stammered, dabbing pathetically at the sprawling stain with a silk handkerchief. Evelyn pressed a button on the intercom embedded in the table. "We need maintenance in the executive boardroom. Immediately. Bring a wet vac." 2 minutes later, the heavy oak doors of the boardroom opened. Daniel Miller stepped in. He kept his head down, a practiced maneuver of the invisible workforce. He wheeled in a small, quiet, wet vacuum and a bucket of heavy-duty stain remover. He wore his faded blue uniform, the name Daniel stitched in red over his left breast pocket. He did not look at the billionaires sitting around the table. He did not look at the breathtaking view of the city. He simply moved to the spill, got down on his hands and knees, and began to work. Evelyn watched him, a sudden cruel idea sparking in her mind. She needed to regain the upper hand with Richard, to demonstrate her absolute dominance and her alignment with his linguistic pride. She wanted to show Richard that she could speak his language, both literally and philosophically. Leaning forward, Evelyn locked eyes with Richard. She decided to use the man scrubbing the floor at her feet as a living, breathing prop. Without missing a beat, Evelyn shifted her tone and spoke in fluid, albeit modern and slightly rigid, Arabic. Translated. "You worry about the bottom rung of the ladder, Richard," Evelyn said in Arabic, her voice echoing in the quiet room over the soft hum of Daniel's vacuum. "But look at this creature at our feet. Look at this man." Richard blinked, surprised by her sudden switch to Arabic, but a slow, intrigued smile crept onto his face. He nodded, signaling her to continue. Translated. "This is the reality of the lower class," Evelyn continued in Arabic, gesturing dismissively toward Daniel, who was currently scrubbing the white fibers of the rug with a coarse brush. "They are born without the fire of ambition. They exist only to clean the dirt from the shoes of those who conquer. He is a faceless servant of failure, a man who has amounted to nothing, whose only purpose is to wipe up the mistakes of his betters. Why should we value the loyalty of sheep when we are the wolves?" Richard chuckled softly. It was a dark, cynical sound. He was mildly repulsed by her blatant cruelty, but undeniably impressed by her vocabulary and her seamless transition into the language. "A harsh assessment, Evelyn," Richard replied, also in Arabic, leaning into the game. "But a wolf that starves its sheep will eventually find itself with nothing to eat." "Let them starve," Evelyn replied in Arabic, a smirk playing on her lips. "There is always another peasant ready to hold the mop." The executives at the table, including William, sat in awkward silence. They didn't understand a word being said, but they recognized the mocking tone, the condescending glances directed at the janitor on the floor. It was a power play, plain and simple. Evelyn was marking her territory. Daniel heard every single word. For 5 years, he had endured the invisible slights, the condescending tones, the literal dirt of the upper class. He had swallowed his pride 1,000 times for Chloe. He would gladly scrub toilets for the rest of his life if it meant his daughter could breathe easily. But as he knelt on the plush carpet, the harsh, arrogant Arabic syllables washing over him, something deep inside Daniel Miller snapped. It wasn't anger. Anger was a wild, uncontrollable thing. This was something colder, something older. It was dignity. He finished extracting the last of the coffee from the rug. He turned off the small, wet vac. The sudden silence in the room was deafening. Daniel slowly stood up. He did not grab his bucket. He did not rush to the door. Instead, he stood tall. The permanent stoop in his shoulders vanished, replaced by the rigid, commanding posture of a man who had once lectured to halls of hundreds of brilliant minds. He turned and looked directly at Evelyn Harrington. Evelyn's smirk faltered as the janitor locked eyes with her. His gaze was not submissive. It was piercing, intelligent, and uncomfortably intense. For a brief, irrational moment, she felt like a misbehaving child being evaluated by a strict headmaster. "You missed a spot, Daniel. You can leave," Evelyn snapped in English, suddenly eager to break the eye contact. Daniel did not move. Instead, he took a slow, deliberate breath, and when he spoke, his voice was a deep, resonant baritone that commanded the sheer acoustic space of the massive boardroom. He did not speak English. He spoke in classical Arabic, al-Fusha, the ancient, poetic, and highly complex form of the language used in classical literature and historical texts. It was a tier of the language so elevated, so rich in nuance and historical weight, that it made Evelyn's expensive corporate Arabic sound like the babbling of a toddler in a sandbox. Translated. The arrogance of the high castle does not change the foundation of the earth. Daniel's voice rolled through the room, perfectly inflected, carrying the rhythm of a master poet. You speak of wolves and sheep, yet you possess the wisdom of neither. Evelyn's jaw dropped. The color completely drained from her face. She sat frozen, paralyzed by the sheer impossibility of what was happening. Her brain struggled to process the flawless, melodic syllables coming from the mouth of the man in the faded blue uniform. Daniel took a single step closer to the table, his eyes shifting from Evelyn to Richard Montgomery. Richard had physically recoiled in his chair, his eyes wide with absolute, unadulterated shock. Richard knew enough to recognize the profound linguistic mastery he was witnessing. Daniel continued, quoting a famous ancient proverb, adapting it with terrifying precision to the moment. Translated. He who considers himself a god among men will soon find himself choking on the dust of his own making. You clothe yourself in silk and gold, yet you bear a soul of astonishing poverty. True royalty, madam, is not the heavy gold upon your wrist, nor the glass tower in which you hide. It is the grace upon your tongue and the mercy in your heart. You possess neither. The silence that followed was absolute. The air in the boardroom felt as though it had been sucked out into the Chicago wind. William and the other executives darted panicked glances between their paralyzed CEO and the majestic, terrifying janitor, entirely lost as to what had just been said, but deeply aware that the fabric of reality in the room had just been ripped apart. Daniel held Evelyn's horrified gaze for 3 agonizing seconds. Then he offered a slow, slight, flawlessly executed bow of the head, a gesture of ancient, mocking respect. He picked up his yellow bucket by the plastic handle, turned on his heel, and walked out of the heavy oak doors, shutting them quietly behind him. Inside the boardroom, the silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Evelyn's heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Her face was flushed with a hot, agonizing humiliation that she had never experienced in her entire life. She, the untouchable billionaire, had just been intellectually and culturally eviscerated by a man holding a toilet brush. She slowly turned her head to look at Richard, desperate to salvage the situation, to laugh it off, to say anything. But the look on Richard Montgomery's face stopped her cold. Richard was not looking at the door where Daniel had exited. He was looking at Evelyn, and the expression in his eyes had fundamentally changed. The professional respect, the cautious admiration he had held for her business acumen just 10 minutes ago, was entirely gone. In its place was a profound, icy disgust. "Richard," Evelyn started, her voice trembling slightly, the English words feeling clumsy in her mouth. I don't know who that was, or how he—" Richard held up a single hand, silencing her instantly. He slowly closed his leather portfolio. "For 20 years, Richard said, his voice quiet, lacking any of its former warmth. I have negotiated with kings, presidents, and warlords. I have sat in tents in the desert and palaces in the city. And in all that time, I have learned one universal truth about leadership." He stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. "How a leader treats the most defenseless person in the room is the exact measure of their character," Richard continued, his eyes drilling into Evelyn's soul. "You learned a language to show off, Evelyn, to mock a man you thought was deaf to your cruelty. That man, whoever he is, just spoke with the dialect of kings. He possesses more dignity in his worn boots than you have in your entire empire." "Richard, please, the deal," Evelyn stammered, standing up. "There is no deal," Richard said flatly, gesturing for his team to pack their briefcases. "I will not tie $4 billion of my investors' capital to a woman who views humanity as a disposable commodity. If you are willing to casually degrade a man scrubbing your floors, you will eventually betray us when it suits your bottom line." Richard walked toward the door, pausing just before he exited. He looked back at Evelyn, who was gripping the edge of the mahogany table to keep from collapsing. "You should find that man," Richard said softly. "And you should beg for his forgiveness, not because it will save this deal, but because it might just save your soul." The door clicked shut. Evelyn Harrington was left standing in the ruins of her greatest triumph, the ancient, beautiful words of a broken janitor still echoing in her ears. The heavy oak doors of the boardroom clicked shut, sealing the catastrophic silence within. Evelyn Harrington stood frozen at the head of the mahogany table, her knuckles entirely white as she gripped the polished wood. The $4 billion deal, the absolute pinnacle of her career, the crowning achievement that was supposed to permanently secure her legacy, had just vaporized into the thin, chilled air of the 54th floor. "Evelyn?" William, her chief financial officer, whispered. He was still clutching his damp silk handkerchief, his face pale and slick with a cold sweat. "What? What just happened? What did Montgomery say? Who was that guy?" Evelyn did not answer him. She couldn't. Her mind was a chaotic storm of shock, humiliation, and a rapidly terrifying sense of vulnerability. She had built her entire persona on being the smartest, most untouchable person in any room. She was the apex predator of Chicago's financial district. Yet a man wearing a minimum wage uniform and smelling of industrial bleach had just dismantled her entire world view with a few meticulously chosen sentences. She finally released her grip on the table. Her hands were shaking. "Get out," Evelyn said, her voice a hollow, razor-thin rasp. "Evelyn, we need to do damage control. If the board finds out Richard walked away—" "I said get out, William!" she screamed, the sudden explosion of volume making every executive in the room flinch. "All of you, out!" They scrambled. Briefcases were snapped shut, and within 30 seconds the boardroom was entirely empty, save for Evelyn and the faint lingering scent of spilled dark roast coffee. She collapsed into her leather chair, pressing the heels of her hands into her eyes. "The grace upon your tongue and the mercy in your heart. You possess neither." The janitor's flawless, ancient Arabic echoed relentlessly in her skull. It was not just the language that had shattered her. It was the sheer, crushing weight of his authority. She snatched her desk phone, stabbing the extension for her head of human resources, a formidable, fiercely efficient woman named Patricia. "Patricia," Evelyn demanded, fighting to keep her voice steady. "I need the employment file for the maintenance worker assigned to the 54th floor this morning. His name tag said Daniel." "The morning crew is contracted through Vanguard Facilities, Evelyn," Patricia replied, typing rapidly on the other end. "We don't hold their full corporate dossiers, but I can pull the security clearance file." "Get it. Bring it to my office. Now." 10 minutes later, Evelyn was sitting behind her massive glass desk, staring at a thin, manila folder. Patricia stood awkwardly near the door. "There isn't much there," Patricia offered tentatively. "He passed a standard background check. No criminal record. Started 3 months ago." Evelyn opened the file. There was a photocopied driver's license. The face was exhausted, the eyes hollow, but it was undeniably the man from the boardroom. Daniel Miller, age 38. Address, a lower-income zip code on the south side. She flipped to the secondary background check forms required for executive floor clearance. Her eyes scanned the education section, expecting to see a high school diploma or a GED. She stopped. The blood roared in her ears. Under highest level of education completed, it read, PhD, Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations, Georgetown University. Under previous employment, it read, Tenured Professor of Semitic Linguistics, Georgetown University, 2014-2021. "This is impossible," Evelyn whispered, the paper trembling in her hands. She turned to her computer and typed Dr. Daniel Miller, Georgetown into the search engine. Instantly, dozens of results flooded the screen. academic journals, archived university faculty pages, and prestigious linguistic awards. There were photos of a younger, vibrant Daniel, smiling in tweed jackets, holding heavy, ancient textbooks. He was one of the world's leading experts in classical Arabic and ancient Nabatean dialects. "What happened?" Evelyn murmured to herself, her finger scrolling down the screen. She found her answer in a small, localized GoFundMe campaign from 4 years prior, archived on a community page. The photo showed Daniel, looking frantic and exhausted, standing beside a hospital bed. In the bed was a beautiful, frail woman. "Help Save Rachel Miller," the title read. The description detailed an aggressive neurological disease, out-of-network experimental treatments, and a devastating medical bankruptcy. Further down the page, an update posted 3 years ago read, "Rachel passed away peacefully this morning. Dr. Miller is stepping away from academia to care for their daughter, Chloe, who is battling severe chronic respiratory failure. Thank you for your prayers." Evelyn leaned back in her chair, the air completely knocked out of her lungs. She had looked at a grieving widower, a desperately terrified father, and a world-renowned scholar, and she had called him a faceless servant of failure. She had used him as a prop to demonstrate her own superiority. The realization of her own monstrous behavior crashed down upon her with the force of a collapsing building. Richard Montgomery was right. She didn't just lose a $4 billion deal, she had lost her humanity. And she had done it publicly, arrogantly, and in a language she barely understood compared to the master she had tried to mock. She reached for her phone. She didn't know what she was going to do, but she knew she had to find him. On the opposite side of the city, Daniel Miller was not thinking about billionaires, boardroom politics, or ancient poetry. He was running. He had barely finished his shift, stripping off his blue uniform in the locker room, when his cheap prepaid cell phone buzzed. It was a text from Mrs. Gable, the elderly neighbor who watched Chloe in the mornings before school. "Daniel, come quick. Chloe's lips are blue. The nebulizer isn't working." I called 911. Daniel's heart stopped. The world around him tunneled into a singular, terrifying point of focus. He sprinted out of the Harrington building, throwing himself onto the crowded morning subway, praying with a desperate, frantic energy that defied all linguistic logic. By the time he burst through the swinging doors of the emergency room at Chicago Memorial, he was soaked in a cold sweat. The ER was a chaotic sea of misery. Crying children, groaning adults, and the relentless, sharp beeping of monitors. "My daughter!" Daniel shouted, rushing the triage desk. "Chloe Miller, 7 years old. She was brought in by ambulance." The triage nurse looked up, her expression exhausted but sympathetic. "She's in Trauma Bay 3, Mr. Miller. Dr. Evans is with her now. She's stabilized, but her oxygen levels dropped dangerously low." Daniel bypassed the desk, rushing through the double doors. He found Chloe in a stark, brightly lit room. She looked impossibly small on the hospital gurney, an oxygen mask strapped to her pale face. Her chest was heaving with the effort of every breath. "Daddy!" she whimpered, her voice muffled by the plastic mask. "I'm here, sweetie, I'm right here!" Daniel choked out, rushing to her side and gripping her tiny, cold hand. He kissed her forehead, murmuring soft, comforting words in a mixture of English and Aramaic, a private language they shared to keep her calm. Dr. Evans, a harried-looking physician in green scrubs, approached with a clipboard. "Mr. Miller, her asthma is incredibly brittle. This cold weather is a massive trigger. The standard albuterol isn't cutting it anymore. We need to look into biological therapies, monoclonal antibodies. It's a monthly injection that targets the specific proteins causing her inflammation." "Do it," Daniel said instantly. "Whatever it takes." Dr. Evans hesitated, glancing at the chart. It's exceptionally expensive, Daniel. Upwards of $3,000 a month. I'm looking at your insurance file here. Vanguard Facilities Maintenance Plan. They won't cover it. It's classified as Tier 4 experimental for her specific age group. Daniel felt the ground open up beneath him, the familiar, suffocating grip of the American medical system wrapped around his throat. He had given up his career, his dignity, and his sleep for this insurance, and it was still entirely useless when it truly mattered. "I'll figure it out," Daniel said, his voice hard, though panic screamed in his mind. "I'll take another shift. I'll take a loan, just keep her breathing." An hour later, Chloe had fallen into an exhausted, medicated sleep. Daniel was sitting in a hard plastic chair in the hallway outside her room, his head buried in his hands. He felt entirely broken. The fierce, dignified man who had stood up to Evelyn Harrington was gone, replaced by a father drowning in an ocean of despair. "Dr. Miller?" The voice was hesitant, quiet, and entirely out of place in the grim, linoleum-tiled hallway of the public hospital. Daniel looked up. Standing 10 feet away was Evelyn Harrington. She looked utterly alien in this environment. She was wearing a custom-tailored $5,000 charcoal suit, her immaculate heels clicking softly on the floor. But the arrogant, icy armor she had worn in the boardroom was gone. She looked pale, small, and profoundly uncomfortable. Daniel stared at her, his expression hardening into stone. "How did you find me?" "I had my security team track your cell phone," Evelyn admitted, taking a cautious step forward. "I know I have no right to be here. I know I crossed a line." "You crossed a line?" Daniel let out a bitter, exhausted laugh. "You don't even know where the line is, Ms. Harrington. You live on a different planet. What do you want? Did I leave a streak on your imported rug?" Evelyn winced, the words hitting her like a physical blow. She pulled a slim, leather checkbook from her designer bag. "I came to fix this," she said rapidly, falling back into her comfort zone of transactional problem-solving. "I know about your wife, I know about your bankruptcy, and I just spoke to the charge nurse. I know about Chloe. I want to help." She clicked a silver pen and began to write. "I am writing you a personal check for $250,000. It will clear instantly. It will cover your daughter's medical bills, your debts, everything. In exchange?" She hesitated, her eyes darting away. "In exchange, I need you to call Richard Montgomery. I need you to tell him that I apologized, that it was a misunderstanding. I need him back at the table." Daniel looked at the check she extended toward him. $250,000. It was salvation. It was Chloe's medicine. It was a new apartment. It was freedom from the crushing weight that had suffocated him for 5 years. He looked from the check to Evelyn's face. She was desperate. She was trying to buy her way out of moral bankruptcy. Daniel stood up slowly. He didn't take the check. "You really think," Daniel said, his voice barely above a whisper, yet carrying a lethal intensity, "that the universe operates entirely on a ledger of credits and debits? You think you can pour poison into a well and then just buy the people you forced to drink from it?" "It's $250,000, Daniel," Evelyn pleaded, her voice cracking. "Please, I am trying to apologize." "No, you aren't," Daniel corrected her. "You are trying to buy an alibi. You are trying to purchase my forgiveness so you can secure your $4 billion deal. You didn't come here because you care about my daughter. You came here because you care about your stock price." Evelyn froze. Her hand holding the check trembled. "Put your money away, Evelyn," Daniel said, using her first name, stripping away her title and her power. "My daughter's life is not a bargaining chip for your corporate vanity. I would rather scrub toilets for the rest of my life than teach you that your cruelty can be swept away with a signature." He turned his back on her, walking back into Chloe's room, leaving Evelyn standing alone in the bleak hospital hallway. The check in her hand suddenly felt like nothing more than a worthless scrap of paper. For the first time in her life, Evelyn Harrington had encountered a problem that could not be bullied, intimidated, or bought. She walked out of Chicago Memorial Hospital feeling entirely numb. The cold wind whipping off Lake Michigan tore at her tailored suit, but she barely felt it. She got into the back of her waiting black SUV. "Where to, Ms. Harrington?" her driver asked. Just drive, Marcus. Anywhere." Evelyn stared out the tinted window at the gray, sprawling city. Daniel Miller's words echoed relentlessly in her mind. "You are trying to buy an alibi." She pulled out her phone and opened the digital dossier HR had compiled on Daniel. She scrolled past his academic achievements and stopped at the medical bankruptcy records. She looked at the itemized list of debts. Then, she looked at Chloe's medical file, which her security team had illegally but efficiently acquired from the hospital database. Severe brittle asthma. Requires monoclonal antibody therapy. Denied by current insurance. Evelyn closed her eyes. She thought about her own father, the founder of Harrington Logistics. He had been a ruthless man, a titan of industry who taught her that compassion was a fatal weakness in business. "Wolves and sheep, Evelyn," he used to say. "Pick your side." She had picked the wolf, and today it had cost her the biggest deal of her life and exposed her as a moral fraud. But as she looked at Chloe's medical file, a strange, terrifying realization washed over her. She didn't just have money, she had power. Massive, structural, systemic power. The kind of power that built hospitals, that funded pharmaceutical research, that dictated the terms of the game. She opened her eyes. The icy pragmatism that made her a terrifying CEO snapped back into place. But this time, the target was different. "Marcus," Evelyn said sharply, "turn the car around, go back to the hospital, and hand me the secure satellite phone." 10 minutes later, Evelyn strode back into the emergency room. She bypassed the triage desk completely and walked directly down the hall to Trauma Bay 3. Daniel was sitting by Chloe's bed, reading an old, worn paperback. He looked up as she entered, his jaw tightening. "I thought I told you." "I don't care what you told me, Dr. Miller," Evelyn interrupted, her voice entirely devoid of the desperate pleading from earlier. It was authoritative, crisp, and commanding. "I made a phone call." Daniel stood up, his eyes narrowing. "If you called security or child services..." "I called Dr. Eris Thorne," Evelyn stated flatly. "He is the chief of pediatric pulmonology at Johns Hopkins. He is currently boarding a private Gulfstream jet that my company owns. He will be in Chicago in 2 hours." Daniel stared at her, stunned into silence. Dr. Eris Thorne was a legend in the medical community. He was the pioneer of the exact monoclonal antibody therapy Chloe needed. He was a doctor who didn't take new patients unless they were royalty. "Why?" Daniel finally managed to ask, his voice rough. "Because your insurance won't cover the treatment," Evelyn said, stepping closer to the bed and looking down at the sleeping little girl. "And because my company, Harrington Logistics, is the primary supply chain distributor for the pharmaceutical firm that manufactures that exact biological therapy. I don't need to write you a check, Daniel. I just need to make an internal phone call to the distribution warehouse in New Jersey." Daniel's mind raced. "What is the catch? What do you want? I told you I'm not calling Montgomery for you." Evelyn looked at him, her piercing blue eyes entirely serious. "I don't want you to call Montgomery. That deal is dead. I killed it with my own arrogance. I have to live with that." "Then why are you doing this?" "Because you were right," Evelyn said, the words tasting strange and foreign on her tongue. "My soul is in poverty. I built an empire on treating people like disposable assets. Today I looked in the mirror and I despised what I saw. I am doing this because this little girl needs to breathe and I have the power to make it happen. No catch, no strings, no NDAs." Daniel studied her face, looking for the trap, looking for the corporate pivot. But he saw only a genuine, slightly terrified sincerity. "However," Evelyn continued, her business instincts refusing to die completely, "I do have a proposition for you, completely separate from Chloe's medical care. Daniel crossed his arms. I'm listening. My company's board of directors is going to attempt to remove me as CEO by the end of the week, when they find out about the Montgomery disaster, Evelyn said, pacing the small hospital room. To survive, I need a massive, unassailable victory. I need to pivot away from Montgomery's fund and secure a direct partnership with the Sovereign Wealth Fund of the UAE. She stopped and looked at Daniel. I don't just need a translator. I need a cultural architect. I need someone who understands the history, the nuance, and the psychology of the Middle East better than anyone else on the planet. I need someone who can negotiate with ancient grace. Daniel let out a slow breath. You want to hire me? I want to make you the Vice President of International Relations for Harrington Logistics, Evelyn corrected him. Your starting salary will be $600,000 a year, plus stock options. You will have full executive health coverage, which covers Chloe's treatments completely, legally, without any strings attached to me personally. You will have an office next to mine. Daniel looked at the woman he had utterly despised just a few hours ago. He looked at her tailored suit, her desperate eyes, and the terrifying, beautiful complexity of her offer. She was offering him his life back. She was offering Chloe her future. And if I say no? Daniel asked. If I take my daughter and walk away? Then Dr. Thorne will still treat Chloe today, on my dime, Evelyn said steadily. And the medication will be provided. Like I said, no strings. But I am asking for your help, Dr. Miller. I need you to teach me how to speak to people without tearing them down. Daniel looked back at Chloe. Her breathing was still shallow, but the blue tint had faded from her lips. He thought about the endless nights scrubbing toilets, the crushing debt, the fear of losing her. Then, he looked back at Evelyn Harrington. He didn't smile, but the hard, cold anger in his eyes finally began to thaw. Vice President of International Relations, Daniel repeated softly. It's yours, Evelyn said. Daniel nodded slowly. We start with Al-Mutanabi. If you want to negotiate with the UAE, you need to understand his poetry. And Evelyn? Yes? You're buying your own coffee from now on. The atmosphere inside the executive boardroom on the 54th floor was toxic. Just 4 days had passed since Evelyn Harrington's catastrophic interaction with Richard Montgomery. But in the hyper-accelerated world of global finance, 4 days was enough time for an empire to catch fire. News of the collapsed $4 billion capital injection had leaked to the financial press. Harrington Logistics stock had plummeted 12% in 48 hours, and the board of directors had descended like vultures smelling blood in the water. At the head of the mahogany table, where Evelyn usually projected unassailable dominance, the air felt suffocating. Surrounding her were 12 of the most ruthless corporate minds in Chicago, led by Harrison Cole, the chairman of the board. Harrison was a man in his late 60s with cold, flat gray eyes and a reputation for corporately executing CEOs who failed to deliver on their promises. This is not a debate, Evelyn, Harrison said, his voice echoing off the floor-to-ceiling windows. He tossed a thick, leather-bound portfolio onto the center of the table. Montgomery walked. The street knows he walked. You promised us this capital injection to modernize the European distribution network. Without it, we are bleeding market share to our competitors. You have alienated our most vital financial lifeline. William, the perpetually sweating CFO, kept his eyes glued to his legal pad, too terrified to look at Evelyn. The Montgomery deal was flawed, Harrison, Evelyn replied, forcing her voice to remain steady. She wore a deep navy suit, her posture rigid, though internally she was fighting a rising tide of panic. His terms were predatory. He wanted 2 seats on the board and veto power over our labor contracts. He was handing us $4 billion, Harrison snapped, slamming his palm on the table. We don't care if he wanted the naming rights to your firstborn child. Your job was to close the deal. You let your ego interfere, and now the board is prepared to vote on a motion of no confidence. We have a fiduciary duty to our shareholders, and right now, you are a liability." The murmurs of agreement around the table were unmistakable. The coup was fully in motion. They were going to strip her of her father's company. "I don't need Montgomery," Evelyn said, raising her chin, "because I am replacing his capital with a superior partner, a direct partnership with the Sovereign Wealth Fund of the United Arab Emirates. $7 billion. No board seats relinquished. A pure strategic alliance." Silence fell over the boardroom. Harrison narrowed his eyes, searching her face for a bluff. "The UAE Sovereign Wealth Fund?" Harrison scoffed, leaning back in his chair. "They don't even return our phone calls. They deal exclusively with legacy infrastructure firms. They view us as new money, Evelyn. You don't have the cultural leverage or the diplomatic connections to even get in the room with their chief investment officer, let alone negotiate a $7 billion pivot in a weekend." "She doesn't," a deep, resonant voice echoed from the heavy oak doors. "But I do." Every head in the room snapped toward the entrance. Standing in the doorway was Daniel Miller. But this was not the man who had pushed a yellow mop bucket 4 days ago. The faded blue janitorial uniform was gone, replaced by a perfectly tailored charcoal gray Tom Ford suit that Evelyn had overnighted to his apartment. His silver-threaded hair was neatly trimmed, and he held a leather briefcase with the casual, commanding grip of a man accustomed to absolute authority. His posture was towering, exuding a quiet, terrifying intellect. William, the CFO, gasped audibly, his pen clattering onto the mahogany table. He recognized the face, but his brain completely failed to reconcile the maintenance worker with the imposing titan currently stepping into the room. "Who the hell is this?" Harrison demanded, standing up. "Security is supposed to clear this floor." "This," Evelyn said, a slow, confident smile finally breaking through her stress, "is Dr. Daniel Miller. He is the new Vice President of International Relations for Harrington Logistics, and he is leading the UAE negotiations." Harrison stared at Daniel, bewildered. "Dr. Miller? I've never heard of you. What firm did you come from?" Daniel walked slowly toward the table, taking the empty chair to Evelyn's right. He did not ask for permission to sit. He simply claimed the space. He placed his briefcase on the table and unclasped it with a sharp click. "I came from Georgetown University, Mr. Cole," Daniel said, his baritone voice smooth and perfectly modulated, "where I spent the better part of a decade advising the State Department on Middle Eastern economic diplomacy and translating ancient Semitic legal texts. But more recently, I was the man cleaning the coffee stains out of this very rug." The collective shock in the room was palpable. Harrison looked from Daniel to Evelyn, his face turning a deep shade of crimson. "Is this a joke? You hired a janitor to run a $7 billion negotiation? I am calling the vote right now. You are out, Evelyn." "Before you vote, Harrison, you might want to read the fine print of the deal you are so desperate to save," Daniel interrupted, his tone completely devoid of fear. He pulled a stack of documents from his briefcase and slid them down the polished wood toward the chairman. "What is this?" Harrison snapped. "That is Richard Montgomery's internal restructuring manifesto," Daniel said calmly. "It took me 3 hours to analyze the legal loopholes in his term sheet. Montgomery didn't just want 2 board seats. Clause 4B, buried under the asset depreciation schedules, gave his fund the right to unilaterally liquidate Harrington's overseas warehouses if revenue missed projections by even 2%. He wasn't investing in your company, Harrison. He was building a back door to strip it down and sell it for parts. He was going to gut you, fire you, and absorb your market share." Harrison hesitated, putting on his reading glasses. As his eyes scanned the highlighted sections of the document, the color slowly drained from his face. The other board members leaned in, the silence stretching tight. "Furthermore," Daniel continued, seamlessly taking command of the room, "the UAE Sovereign Wealth Fund's Chief Investment Officer, Alexander Grant, is flying into Chicago tomorrow morning. Mr. Grant happens to be a former colleague of mine from our time consulting in Dubai. He is deeply traditional, highly risk-averse, and values institutional loyalty above all else. He detests corporate raiders like Montgomery. Daniel leaned forward, locking eyes with Harrison. Evelyn realized Montgomery was a Trojan horse. She killed the deal to protect this company, and she brought me in because I speak Mr. Grant's language, both literally and philosophically. We have a meeting tomorrow at 10 a.m. If you vote Evelyn out today, I walk out that door, and the UAE deal dies before it even breathes. You will be left with a tanking stock and no capital. Harrison slowly took off his glasses. He looked at Evelyn, then at Daniel. The janitor-turned-executive had just completely neutralized the board's entire argument with lethal precision. 72 hours, Harrison finally rasped, his voice tight with suppressed rage. You have exactly 72 hours to get Alexander Grant's signature on a binding letter of intent. If you fail, Evelyn, you are terminated, and you, Dr. Miller, can go back to pushing a broom. Daniel offered Harrison a cold, polite smile. I prefer a wet vac, Mr. Cole. It's much more efficient at cleaning up messes made by careless executives. The following morning, the private dining room of the Four Seasons Hotel, overlooking the frozen expanse of Lake Michigan, was reserved for the most critical negotiation in the history of Harrington Logistics. Evelyn stood near the window, adjusting the cuffs of her suit, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Daniel stood beside her, impeccably calm, reviewing a series of printed notes. He looked entirely in his element, a master chess player surveying the board before the first move. Are you sure Alexander will even entertain this? Evelyn asked quietly. Harrison was right about one thing. We are new money. We don't have the generational pedigree the UAE fund usually looks for. Alexander Grant is a man who respects substance over pedigree, Daniel replied, not looking up from his notes. He spent 20 years immersed in Middle Eastern culture. He operates on the concept of wasta, trust, influence, and the weight of your personal word. He doesn't care about your father's legacy, Evelyn. He cares about yours. Today, you are not the ruthless corporate shark. You are a leader who understands the value of the people who build your empire. Before Evelyn could respond, the heavy mahogany doors swung open. Alexander Grant stepped into the room. He was a tall, strikingly elegant man in his early 50s, with silver hair and warm, intelligent eyes. Despite his immensely powerful position managing billions of dollars in royal wealth, he possessed a quiet, almost monk-like demeanor. Daniel, Alexander said, a genuine smile breaking across his face. He extended his arms. Alexander? Daniel replied warmly, meeting him in the center of the room for a firm handshake and a traditional embrace. It has been far too long. Thank you for making the journey. When Dr. Daniel Miller calls after 5 years of silence. I get on an airplane, Alexander said, his eyes crinkling at the corners. He turned his attention to Evelyn. His smile faded slightly, replaced by a polite, evaluating gaze. Ms. Harrington, your reputation precedes you. Thank you for your time, Mr. Grant, Evelyn said, stepping forward. She extended her hand, intentionally softening her usual aggressive grip. I appreciate you hearing our proposal. They sat at the round table, and the hotel staff poured black coffee and quietly exited. Let us dispense with the corporate theater, Alexander began, stirring his coffee slowly. Daniel has briefed me on your desire for a $7 billion strategic partnership. Financially, Harrington Logistics is highly profitable. Your supply chain metrics are impressive. However, the Sovereign Wealth Fund does not merely invest in balance sheets. We invest in philosophies. Alexander took a sip of his coffee, his eyes locking onto Evelyn. We recently received intelligence regarding your failed negotiations with Richard Montgomery. Word in the financial sector is that you are volatile, ruthless, and view your workforce as entirely expendable. Our fund operates on the principle of generational stability. Why should I tie $7 billion of sovereign wealth to a CEO who builds her castles on the broken backs of her laborers? Evelyn felt a cold sweat prickle at her hairline. The ghost of her previous arrogance was haunting her. She instinctively wanted to pivot, to defend herself with profit margins and efficiency metrics. but she looked at Daniel. He gave her a microscopic, grounding nod. Substance over pedigree. Truth over defense. Evelyn took a deep breath. She didn't look at her notes. She looked Alexander Grant directly in the eyes. "Because the intelligence you received was entirely accurate, Mr. Grant," Evelyn said softly. Alexander raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by her blunt admission. "Up until 4 days ago, I was exactly the person you described," Evelyn continued, her voice trembling slightly but laced with absolute sincerity. "I viewed compassion as a weakness. I viewed my employees as lines on a spreadsheet. I sat in a boardroom and openly mocked a man who was cleaning my floor, simply because I could." She turned to look at Daniel. "That man was Daniel Miller. I insulted him in a language I barely understood, assuming he was deaf to his own degradation. And he responded with a grace and a brilliance that shattered my entire worldview. He showed me the absolute poverty of my own character." Alexander sat perfectly still, his coffee cup suspended in the air. He looked at Daniel, then back at Evelyn. "I am not asking for your investment because I am perfect, Mr. Grant," Evelyn said, her voice gaining strength. "I am asking for it because I am awake. As of this morning, Harrington Logistics has completely restructured our internal corporate policy. We have instituted fully paid Tier 1 medical coverage for every single employee, from the executive floor down to the contracted maintenance staff. We have created a $200 million educational trust for the dependents of our lowest-wage workers. We are no longer treating our people as disposable machinery." Evelyn slid a sleek, leather-bound folder across the table. "I am not selling you a ruthless logistics company anymore. I am offering a partnership with a company that understands true loyalty must be earned from the bottom up." Alexander slowly opened the folder, his eyes scanning the newly drafted corporate policies. The silence in the room was thick, heavy with the weight of billions of dollars and profound human vulnerability. Suddenly, the dining room doors burst open. "Well, isn't this a touching scene of corporate redemption?" a mocking, familiar voice sneered. Richard Montgomery strode into the room, flanked by 2 of his sharp-suited analysts. He looked furious, his usual diplomatic veneer completely stripped away. He had caught wind of the UAE meeting and had used his immense hotel connections to bypass security. "Richard," Evelyn said, standing up, her heart dropping into her stomach, "you are trespassing." "I am saving my old friend Alexander from making a catastrophic mistake," Richard said, ignoring Evelyn and looking directly at the chief investment officer. "Alexander, this woman is a fraud. She is playing you. She tanked our $4 billion deal out of sheer ego, and now she's parading her new pet intellectual around to clean up her mess." Richard pointed a perfectly manicured finger at Daniel. "This man isn't an executive. He's a bankrupt janitor. He was scrubbing toilets in her building on Monday. You are going to trust the royal wealth of the Emirates to a desperate woman and a disgraced academic?" Alexander Grant slowly closed the leather folder. He looked at Richard, his expression entirely unreadable. Daniel stood up. He did not raise his voice. He did not show an ounce of anger. He simply looked at Richard Montgomery with the same ancient, chilling calm he had displayed in the boardroom. Daniel spoke in English, ensuring every word resonated perfectly. "You mistake desperation for revelation, Richard. You operate in a world where everything has a price tag, including dignity. But you fundamentally misunderstand the nature of power. True power does not scream from the doorway. It does not belittle. True power builds." Daniel turned slightly, gesturing to Evelyn. "You saw a CEO who made a mistake. I saw a leader with the courage to tear down her own ego and rebuild her company's foundation to protect the vulnerable. You tried to buy Harrington Logistics to strip it bare. We are here to ensure it lasts a century." Richard sneered, stepping closer. "Poetic, Dr. Miller, but business isn't poetry, it's math. And Alexander knows the math. Our fund can offer the UAE a guaranteed 15% return, structured through offshore holdings. Harrington can't match our liquidity." Richard turned to Alexander, a triumphant, arrogant smile on his face. Walk away from this sinking ship, Alex. Come to my office. We will structure the logistics merger ourselves. Alexander Grant looked at Richard for a long, agonizing moment. Then, he let out a quiet, disappointed sigh. He stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. He did not look at Richard. He looked at Daniel, and then at Evelyn. There is a famous proverb by the poet Al-Mutanabbi, Alexander said softly, his voice carrying the quiet weight of immense authority. He wrote, "If you honor the noble, you will possess him. But if you honor the vile, he will rebel." Alexander turned his cold, evaluating gaze upon Richard Montgomery. "You are a vile man, Richard. You view destruction as a business model. You burst into my meeting without an invitation, lacking all respect for the sanctity of negotiation. You insulted my colleague, Dr. Miller, a man whose intellect eclipses yours entirely. The Sovereign Wealth Fund has no interest in your liquidity, and we certainly have no interest in your lack of honor." Richard's triumphant smile vanished, replaced by an expression of absolute shock. "Alexander, be reasonable. You are dismissed, Mr. Montgomery," Alexander said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "If you ever interrupt a meeting of mine again, I will personally ensure your fund is blacklisted from every financial institution from Dubai to Riyadh. Get out." Richard stood frozen, his face burning with a humiliation so profound it seemed to age him 10 years in a single second. He looked at Evelyn, who stood tall and uncompromising. He looked at Daniel, whose face remained a mask of dignified stone. Realizing he had entirely lost, Richard turned on his heel and stormed out of the room, his analysts scrambling behind him. The heavy doors clicked shut. Alexander Grant turned back to the table. He reached into his breast pocket, withdrew a gold fountain pen, and opened the leather folder Evelyn had provided. "Ms. Harrington," Alexander said, a warm, genuine smile returning to his face. "I am deeply moved by your courage to change. The Sovereign Wealth Fund is proud to partner with Harrington Logistics. Let us build something that lasts." He signed the letter of intent. $7 billion. Evelyn felt the air rush back into her lungs. She looked at the signature, then up at Daniel. For the first time in her life, the victory didn't feel like a conquest. It felt like grace. 6 weeks later, the brutal Chicago winter had begun to thaw, giving way to the soft, promising light of early spring. Inside the pediatric pulmonology wing of Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore, the air was calm and quiet. The beeping monitors that had once been the terrifying soundtrack to Daniel Miller's life were entirely absent. Daniel sat in a plush chair by the window, watching his daughter, Chloe. She was sitting up in bed, vigorously coloring a picture of a dragon. Her cheeks were flushed with a healthy, vibrant pink. She wasn't wheezing. Her chest rose and fell with an effortless, rhythmic ease that Daniel hadn't seen in 4 agonizing years. Dr. William Brooks, the renowned specialist, stood at the foot of the bed, reviewing a chart with a wide smile. "The monoclonal antibody therapy is working flawlessly, Daniel," Dr. Brooks said, adjusting his glasses. "Her lung inflammation markers have dropped to near normal levels. We'll need to continue the monthly injections, but as long as she stays on this regimen, she can live a completely normal, active life. She can run, play in the cold, go to school. She has her childhood back." Daniel closed his eyes, a profound, shuddering breath escaping his lungs. A single tear tracked down his cheek. He had fought the entire world for this exact moment. He had scrubbed the dirt of the city, swallowed his pride, and faced down billionaires, all for the simple miracle of watching his daughter breathe. "Thank you, Dr. Brooks," Daniel whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for everything." "Don't thank me," Dr. Brooks smiled, nodding toward the doorway. "Thank your boss. She moved mountains, and a few private jets, to bypass the red tape." Daniel opened his eyes and looked toward the door. Evelyn Harrington stood leaning against the doorframe. She was dressed down. No power suit, no intimidating heels. Just a simple cashmere sweater and dark jeans. She looked relaxed, younger, and entirely free of the icy armor she used to wear. She walked into the room, holding a small, brightly wrapped box. "Hi, Chloe," Evelyn said softly, walking over to the bed. Chloe looked up, giving Evelyn a massive, gap-toothed smile. "Hi, Miss Evelyn. Look at my dragon. He's breathing fire." "He's magnificent," Evelyn laughed genuinely, sitting on the edge of the bed. She handed the box to the little girl. "I brought you a congratulations present for being so brave." Chloe tore open the paper to reveal a beautifully illustrated, leather-bound collection of ancient fables and myths from around the world. Daniel recognized it instantly. It was a rare, expensive edition he had once admired in a Georgetown bookstore years ago. "Your dad is going to help you read the stories," Evelyn said, brushing a stray lock of hair from Chloe's forehead. "He's the smartest storyteller I know." Daniel watched them, a profound warmth filling his chest. The transition over the last 6 weeks had been miraculous. Following the signing of the UAE deal, Harrison Cole and the hostile board members had been completely silenced. Harrington Logistics stock had skyrocketed to an all-time high. But more importantly, the culture of the company had transformed. Evelyn had kept her word. The new healthcare initiatives for the lower-tier workers had been rolled out flawlessly. Daniel had settled into his role as vice president, using his deep linguistic and cultural expertise to build bridges of trust and respect across the globe. He was no longer the invisible man. He was the moral compass of a multi-billion-dollar empire. After a few minutes of talking about dragons and books, Evelyn stood up and walked over to Daniel by the window. They looked out over the sprawling city of Baltimore. "The board approved the new educational trust fund this morning," Evelyn said quietly. "Full tuition coverage for the children of our warehouse staff. It passed unanimously." "Even Harrison Cole?" Daniel asked, a small smile playing on his lips. "Harrison didn't say a word," Evelyn grinned. "He's terrified of you. He still thinks you might pull another ancient proverb out of your briefcase and publicly destroy him." Daniel chuckled softly. "Words have power, Evelyn, but actions cement them into reality. You are the one who passed the trust fund. You are the one who changed this company." Evelyn looked at him, her blue eyes entirely sincere. "I only changed because someone was finally brave enough to hold up a mirror. You saved my life, Daniel. You saved my soul." She looked back at Chloe, who was happily tracing the gold foil on the cover of her new book. "I owe you a debt I can never repay," Evelyn whispered. Daniel turned to her. He thought about the freezing mornings, the heavy mop bucket, the agonizing terror of watching his daughter struggle for air. And then he looked at the vibrant, breathing child in the bed, and the humbled, compassionate leader standing beside him. "There are no debts here, Evelyn," Daniel said, his deep voice filled with a gentle, ancient grace. "Only investments in the future, and I'd say the returns are looking magnificent." Wasn't Daniel's incredible journey from an invisible janitor to a powerful executive absolutely inspiring? This story proves that true dignity, intelligence, and grace can never be hidden by a uniform, and that even the coldest hearts can be transformed by the power of a second chance. If you loved watching Daniel outsmart the arrogant boardroom and save his daughter's life, make sure to hit that like button. Share this video with friends who need a powerful reminder that true wealth is found in how we treat others. Subscribe and ring the notification bell for more thrilling, dramatic stories like this one. What was your favorite moment of Daniel's triumph? Let us know in the comments below.